Hi, I'm James Dunn. Welcome to the Inside Network. Welcome to INDepth, and my guest today is Andre Roberts, Senior Portfolio Manager for Australian Equities at Invesco. Welcome, Andre.
Thanks, James. Great to be here.
We're going to talk about the changing paradigm in equity markets and the role of smart beta or factor strategies, Andre. And I think a lot of people presume that quantitative investing is looking to capture smart beta. That's the buzz phrase, but I gather the Invesco approach goes well beyond that. So Take us through how you distinguish between smart beta and factors.
Right, yeah, look, they're both systematic approaches, let's be honest. Smart beta, however, it's very rules-based. Typically, you set those rules and apply them maybe a couple of times a year. And so it's a low turnover approach, but it's largely a set it and then come back in 6 months' time and have another go and reset. Whereas a factor approach is a bit more dynamic than that, and certainly you appreciate markets have new information coming continuously. So factor approaches look to get the optimal exposure to those factors that drive returns, and that requires a bit more turnover, a bit more balancing of returns and controlling risks, and that's what you get from a specialist factor investor.
So what are the major factors, and which ones in particular does your approach seek to capture?
Right, so major factors: momentum, quality, value, but also there's the market factors of size, beta and market sensitivity, things like liquidity. These are all factors because they're characteristics that drive the co-movement of stocks. Our approach tries to focus on those return-driving factors, the momentum, quality and value, whilst controlling exposures to all of those unrewarded factors.
So are factors really just specific drivers of return in an equities portfolio that can A, be isolated and B, captured?
Look, there are those factors, as we spoke, that do drive returns, but isolating them is a tricky part, right? Because there's often, due to their complementary nature, there's low correlations, sometimes negative correlations between factors. And so isolating an individual factor can be quite tricky. You can do it, but we'd advocate having a diverse approach across factors, which allows you that benefit of the low correlations, and you get the power of diversification across factors.
Are the factors different in their strength and persistence? I mean by that, are some more longer lived and others more transitory?
Yeah, true. So by strength, I think we're talking about the predictive ability of a factor to differentiate returns of stocks. And the other part was about persistence, and that's about having that ability over a long period of time. They're the factors that we think are true return generators. But the more transitory factors, well, by then contrast, are those that only have a relevance over a short period in time, and thereby require a lot more turnover to be able to capture them. And so it ends up being a bit of I want to say an arms race where market participants jump over each other to get access to that fast diminishing characteristic. And we find that when you bring transaction costs into the consideration and high turnover levels, it's far better to focus on the more persistent set of factors, which gives you that diversification through time.
So can a factor become a crowded trade?
Well, it can be. We find that some of those transient factors end up being a bit of a crowd. We find that even though some of the more persistent factors, people think of them as being, everyone's looking at value at the moment, we find that nonetheless, the observation, the reality is that they still persist as drivers of returns because they're there for a reason. And nonetheless, you have the ability to benefit from getting exposure to these factors that drive the markets.
Andre, are some of the extreme situations we're seeing, such as record low interest rates, COVID last year, now Delta variant in 2021. Are they stressing factor behaviour? Are there some factors that are not performing as might have been expected?
Yeah, that's fair to say. Recent markets have been stressful for factor investors, as have been challenging for all investors. Some of the factor performance has been patchy, and that's to be expected from time to time. Some factors wax whilst others wane. The main takeaway from the last year or so have been to have a diversified approach across factors, which gives you diversification through time as well.
So can we really view factor-based investing as another way of segmenting the equities market?
Segmenting it. It certainly has become another perspective on the equities market, and that's healthy. People can look through different lenses, and being able to assess the market from a factor perspective has been helpful to many investors, and certainly it's been a growing thing.
Where do factors sit in the big debates, such as between growth and value or active versus passive? Do they have a foot in one camp, or do they sit outside those debates?
So let's just think about that active versus passive one, because that's probably a debate where it really does start to have a third pillar, if I can say as much. If you think of a Venn diagram approach where there's active and passive, I'd like to think of factors as being a third Venn where there's overlap between all of three. But yeah, it certainly has a way of saying, factors can be a different but valuable addition to a passive approach, whilst also being complementary to that active approach. So I think it is a bit of a Venn diagram, if you like.
And on the growth v value debate, well, those are both factors.
That's right, and so that's part of the spectrum of factor investing, will be growth versus value for sure.
How dynamic does a factor investor have to be? I suppose a different way of asking that is, how often do factor views change, as in overweighting one factor, de-emphasising another?
Right, look, that would be the ideal, to be able to change your factors in different environments, but it will take a pretty handy crystal ball to do that, right? You'd need to have perfect foresight of the direction of some of the key market levers, like steepening yield curves, and not just the direction, but also the timing. And we find that's very hard to do. We find that every time you tilt towards a factor, it costs your portfolio a lot of turnover. So in short, after transaction costs are considered, when you bring into the consideration of transaction costs, it's far better to have a more static approach to a diversified set of factors, rather than try to rely on perfect foresight on some of the timing indicators.
Do factors carry through truly if you're investing in global markets and then you say turn your attention to the ASX? Or do factors have nuances in the way they're expressed in different markets?
No, factors should have global relevance, because they're a characteristic of stocks, and nothing to particular should stand out for an Aussie versus a global stock. So there should be relevance to those characteristics across regions. What is observable, though, is that the importance that some factors play in Australia is different to other parts of the world. Classically here we observe momentum as being a far more important factor than you might see it in, say, Japan, which is the classic contrast where value is a more important factor.
How does the factor approach allow you to build in an appropriate level of diversification?
Yeah, right. We've talked a bit about diversification across factors because they are complementary in nature, giving you access to that the lower correlation between factors, but also diversification through time. The other part of diversification that's really important is across stocks. With a factor-driven approach, you get the ability to have the contributors to your return being driven by a larger number of stocks, rather than just relying on picking a few winners in a concentrated portfolio.
So if you think of another equities fund that's looking to build in diversification on the sector or capitalisation level, does the factor approach result in more diversification, a more diversified portfolio than a fund trying to diversify using those other methods?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. You certainly get the better set of diversification when you're using factors because you get to benefit from the correlations, you get the benefit through time, and you get to spread your views across stocks, not just relying on a single factor like the market size.
So in the future, Andre, do you think that factors will be accepted as the most efficient way of seeing the stock market?
Oh wow, the most efficient way. Certainly it is growing in its acceptance significantly over the last, decade or so, but really recently it's becoming more widespread. Efficiency is a tricky one, but where factors is more efficient is it does control your return drivers, focus your portfolio on return drivers whilst controlling the risks that are in the portfolio, and that way you do get better efficiency.
Thank you, Andre. I've been speaking to Andre Roberts, Senior Portfolio Manager, Australian Equities at Invesco Quantitative Strategies. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, James. It's great.